Hey everybody, this is Z from CryptoShots, and today I'm going to show you how to write your very first smart contract using the programming language Solidity. So, before writing the code, I would love to tell you something about this programming language. So, Solidity is basically a language that is used to write the smart contract, and smart contracts are basically the building blocks of the blockchain, especially the Ethereum blockchain. And this language is an object-oriented high-level language, and it is somewhat similar to what JavaScript and Python and C++ is. It is somewhat similar, but not completely similar. The syntax is a little bit different, but you can, relate this with these languages as well. And it is a static language. We'll learn about this language a little more when we'll go through the course further ahead. This language is basically necessary to code in the smart contract. So this is what we can know for now. And yeah, there's one thing with this language is that it is a curly bracket language. A curly bracket language means that whatever code you're going to write or whatever the syntax this language is using, it is highly influenced with this curly brackets that you use, right? To write the smart contract, you have to visit this website, which is Remix Ethereum. Just type Remix Ethereum, and the very first result that you'll see, just click on that. So, Remix Ethereum, it is an integrated development environment, which is there for this compilation as well as execution of the smart contract that is written. So, it is not as if, it is the actual deployment of the smart contract on blockchain, but it gives you a test environment, which is very, very necessary for you, right? Because see, if you want to deploy something on the blockchain, it is immutable. So, if you have to test your code, you cannot just go and deploy your code into the blockchain and then say that, okay, let it work, let people change the code if they think that it is wrong. No, you cannot do that. It is immutable. And if you have to do any changes in the blockchain, then you have to write another a copy of that, and then you have to deploy that copy into the blockchain. So it's a cumbersome process. So this Remix Ethereum IDE gives you an option to test the code on the browser extension, and this is how it looks. So when you will load this Remix Ethereum, it will look like this. So there are a lot of plugins like Solidity, Learneth, Saucify. So by default, you have to select the new file over here. So it will ask you for the name of the file that you want to write it. So the code that we are going to write today is basically about the voters count. It's gonna be an exciting project because we see in our day-to-day life that okay, whenever we go to vote for some candidate that is standing there to win, we vote for some candidate and the count of that vote gets incremented every time somebody votes for whosoever is standing for that person. So we are going to write the very first smart contract that we are going to write is to count it, to count how many votes are there for some particular candidate, right? And we'll just get to know about the increment of the count. So let's say that if Salman is going to vote for a candidate one, so his vote will be counted into the variable that will define, and then let's say Aishwarya comes in the next and we want the count to be increased by one. So we'll write the contract. You get the point, right? The example that I'm taking is not so relevant, but yeah. And then let's say that Abhishek comes in and he's very angry, but he has to vote and he's voting for the third person, and so on. I'm just telling you that this is what we will do in this code. So we'll give the name as voting.sol. So SOL is an extension for Solidity language, and you have to use it every time. You have to every time you create the Solidity file, right? So the very first thing, okay, before jotting down the code, it's my duty to tell you that you have to install few plugins. Uh, by default, it will be installed in your browser. But when I started learning about blockchain and Solidity language, we had to activate these modules. So the first one was compiler because as I told you that okay, in order to compile and deploy the code, we have to go to this remix Ethereum. So if this plugin is not activated, then we won't be able to compile this code that we've written. Okay, so I've told you about what we are going to do. We are going to create a smart contract for voting for the increment of the votes that candidate is receiving, right? So let's get started. So, I mean, we write it like this: pragma solidity 0.4.8. So I'll tell you what this is. This is basically the version of Solidity that we're using. So I mean, this caret is used to say that whatever is above this version, this is the basic version, and whatever is above this version, it is compatible with this the code that we're going to write. Okay. The next thing is that we are going to. This is the most important step of the smart contract, defining the name of the contract. So it is defined as like this: voting, I mean, whatever name you want to give. And as I told you that it is a curly bracket language, so here comes the first curly bracket. Okay, so we have created our contract. Now, what we have to do is that we have to create a variable. Now, why variable is because we have to store some data, we have to store some value, right? Because we'll be counting something, and if we have to increment the count, then we have to first of all store the count. So for storing the count, we have to define the count as variable. So let's take count as a variable. And in order to take count as a variable, we have to define what kind of value this count is going to take. Is it going to take a string value? Is it going to take an integer value or an address value, or so on? So I mean, basically, we have to define a data type for this count. So in this example, we are going to take an integer. I mean, we want this variable to be an integer so that it can count the value of the votes that are going to be there for a candidate. So we define the variable like this: uint. Uint is a data type, and this is the variable name, which is count, which will be storing the value of the votes that we are going to give to a candidate. Now, after that, what we are going to do is that we are going to create a function. Now, what is function? Function is basically uh, it is used to perform some kind of operation, so that I mean we can inspect the value that we are passing. So we'll give the function name as count, let's say, right? But before giving the function name as count, we want the count value to be returned. Returned as in I mean we want the count value to be displayed onto our screen. Okay, so in order to do that, so this function is going to read the value of the count from the smart contract. All right, so we define it like this: function get count. All right, and whenever we define the function, we always give the parenthesis after the function name. So this is function and this is the function name. You can give it any name, but just to keep it relevant, I have given the function name as get count, and then again the curly braces. Over here, what you want to return, you want to return the value of count, right? The count variable that we have defined. All right, so we have defined the count as integer, and we are now returning the value of count. Now the next thing that we have to do is that basically, and that is the most important step, that we have to write a function so that we can get to see the increment of the count, right? So we can do it like this: we'll write the keyword as function, then we'll give the function name as, okay, voting increment, and again parenthesis, and then curly braces. You have to use a lot of curly braces. And then how we can display the count to be incremented, right? So we can do it like this: we'll say count equals to count plus 1. This way we'll be able to increment the value of count. Now we have written the code, but we have just written it 50%. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to define the initial value of the variable count. Now, why do we have to define the initial value of count? Because we have to initialize the voting from 0, right? We have to take in the count of the voter number 1 who has voted for that candidate, right? So we can initialize the value of the count just like this. So constructor is basically a keyword that is used to initialize the value, right? And over here it is initializing the value of the count, and this constructor keyword is always run once whenever you deploy a smart contract, and it will always be there. If you Whether you initialize the value or not, it will always run whenever you will deploy the smart contract. Okay, so you define the constructor just like this, and I have to tell you something about this keyword public. So this keyword public, it defines the visibility, and it is used to define that this function is accessible outside of the smart contract as well, right? So I mean, if you write the function as public, this states that this function is accessible outside of the smart contract, and anybody who wants to do the changes can access this function. So I mean, most of the times whenever you define the functions in this programming language Solidity, you have to define the functions as public. Not always, I would say, but yeah, most of the times, whosoever's values you want to be inserted from the outside, or you want people to, give the input out of the smart contract, you have to define those functions public. So we have defined the function get count as public, as well as we are defining the voting increment function also as public. And there are few more keywords that we can use, just like internal and external, but we won't discuss those keywords right now. We'll discuss those keywords later on when we'll go through the series. So in order to implement this function get count, we have defined this function as public. Now next we have to write down view, and then we have to write down the value that we are going to return over here. So we are returning an integer, so we will write the return value as we are returning the count. And what is the data type of the count? It's an integer, right? So this is how you will write down the function of getting count, and this function is for the increment of the count, that whenever some other person, in our case, let's say Shwarya was coming and she voted for this candidate, so the value of the count should get incremented by the amount 1. All right. So this concludes, yeah. Oh, right. So we were writing the constructor. So what constructor will do is that it will initialize the value of count. So we want the initial value of count to be 0. So we'll write it down like this: constructor public count, and count is equals to 0. So we will come over here. So this concludes our code, I guess, and we'll come to the compiler. We'll compile this smart contract and we'll see if there is any kind of error. Not really. I don't think so. I mean, yes, all blue ticks are there. There is no red tick. And yeah, so this compiles our very first smart contract. And now let's deploy it. So for deployment, this is the compiler that you have to select, right? Otherwise, it will throw an error. So just take a note of this compiler 0.4 point. Write it down over here as well. 0.4.256, right? So you have to use this compiler with this version of Solidity. Otherwise, it will throw an error. And for deployment, you have to come over here. This is for the compilation and this is for the deployment. So the environment is JavaScript and the account. The crazy thing about these accounts is, as I told you earlier, that Remix Ethereum is only for the testing cases, right? So uh, this Remix Ethereum provides us with numerous accounts. I would say more than 10 accounts, right? And I mean, 100 ethers are already fake ethers. These are fake ethers. These are not real ethers. So you cannot do the transactions in real. These are just fake ethers so that you can test your contracts. And this is the gas limit. You don't have to disturb these, and you have to select the contract. So this is our contract that we have created, voting count, right? And let's deploy it now. So yeah, it got deployed successfully. You can see the right tick over here, right? Now we can come over here. We can see the functions that we have created. First function is get count. The other one is voting increment, and we have defined the functions as public, so we are able to see these functions outside of the smart contract as well, right? So if we click on this get count, we'll see the value as 0 because in the constructor we have defined the value of count to be 0. Initially it is 0, right? Now if we execute this function, which is voting increment function, according to our smart contract that we have written, the value of get count should increment by 1, right? So let's click on this function, execute this function, voting. It got executed correctly. You can see this is the log section. You can see the logs over here, right? So it got incremented. It should increment by the amount 1. Let's see. Let's call the function get count and return the value of count. Yeah, so yeah, it's over here. It got incremented by 1. So Salman is successfully voted for the candidate 1. Now let's see whether Aishwarya has successfully voted for the candidate 1 or not. It got executed. You can check out the value of get count. Yeah, that's great. Salman and Aishwarya both are voting for the same candidate. Now let's see angry Abhishek. What about him? Let's execute this function once again. Got executed once again. Yeah. So all three of these guys are voting for the same candidate. Jokes apart, how we have created a first smart contract and mm, see, I would love to take the lectures in English and Hindi both, but I'm comfortable with both the languages, and I want you guys to let me know in the comment section in which language do you want me to create these programming languages, codes, as well as the series that I'm gonna create, because I'm gonna post a lot of videos. So to you people should feel as if you're getting the value out of the content that I'm creating. If you want me to create these videos in both English and Hindi, I'm very happy to do that as well. But for now, I'll be creating the videos in English. And if you have any doubt and if you have any issues that you think you want me to solve or you think that you are facing while executing the smart contract, you can contact me or you can write it down in the comment section and I'm ready to help. So guys, this was the first smart contract that we created, and yeah, please subscribe and like in order to know about the next video that I'm going to release. And yeah, keep supporting and keep enjoying. Thank you.